Hello, welcome to the Pretentious Film Majors. We're joined by director Denny Tedesco today in our first in-studio interview for his movie, The Wrecking Crew. How are you?
Great, excellent.
Tell us about The Wrecking Crew.
Well, The Wrecking Crew, it's a documentary I started 16 years ago. It's the story of the session musicians in Los Angeles in the 60s and early 70s. And they were the session musicians that basically did all the recording dates for the Beach Boys. They were the Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. They did Sinatra dates. They did Mamas and Papas. They did Birds dates. They did Jan and Dean, Fifth Dimension. Anything that was being recorded in LA in the 60s most likely had these folks on it. And they were session players that went from recording to recording to recording. You know, start at 8 in the morning, sometimes go to midnight. And no one knew it was the same group of musicians. And my dad was one of these studio musicians, and in 1996, he was diagnosed with cancer, and I knew I wanted to tell his story, so I put together my friends, filmmakers, and we started a documentary. And here I am, 2012.
Great.
Yeah.
What interested you in documentary filmmaking?
Well, I worked on IMAX films for a long time, in the late 80s, early 90s. So I was always into documentaries, and then I had a chance to jump into my own documentary around 1996. My dad was a studio musician, and he was diagnosed with cancer. So I knew he had such a history that I wanted to record his history, so I put all my friends together and we started making a documentary, 1996.
That's pretty cool. And what was the process of putting this film together?
Well, I knew time was of essence because I knew I didn't have much time with him. And I was shooting film at the time, so that was, you know, speaking of pretentious, that was a major pretentious move on my part, because we all as filmmakers wanted to be, have the best of everything. Well, I could shoot film because we were shooting film at the time, and I had an opportunity to have film cameras with me, and my DPs were great, and so we shot film for a long time, and sooner or later I had a 14-minute piece built after my dad passed. In 1997 he passed, and I was hoping that I would basically I knew the middle, the beginning, the middle, and the end. I was hoping it would be picked up like that, but unfortunately it wasn't. The movie's based on, it's called The Wrecking Crew, and there's a reason it's called The Wrecking Crew. It's the old guys in the music business said these guys, meaning these musicians, these young Turks, were going to wreck the business playing this rock and roll crap. And so when my dad and these guys broke into the early 60s, they were doing the Jan and Dean days, they were doing the Beach Boys stuff, the Phil Spector stuff, and sooner or later they were kind of doing all of the Birds, and not Birds, but a lot of stuff. So the Wrecking Crew is based on that term, they're going to wreck the business. And I thought it was going to be a quick, turnaround. But everybody kept saying, you have so much music in it, you're never going to be able to, get everybody to agree on the rights to this music. And I said, well, I have to have the music, for the film. So I just kept going, and here I am in, what are we in, 2012?
Yep.
Still not released, but I've been, in 2008, we did a wonderful tour of festivals, lots of awards, lots of reviews. But 2008, the world came to an end with independent production. People were like, no one wanted to talk to you about a music documentary. So, but instead of giving up, I just kept going, and then started taking like donations and paying off labels.
That's pretty cool.
Does that make any sense?
It does make sense.
Okay.
It sounds pretty cool. And what about your father's involvement in The Wrecking Crew made you want to make this film?
Growing up, someone asked me, did you know what your dad, the impact he made? My dad went to work just like anybody else's dad. He just had, guitars instead of a hammer. I really didn't realize it until maybe I was in high school when I started hearing his name on the radio, but only because he was a jazz guitarist. I knew he played with the Beach Boys. I knew he was like the lead on Batman or Green Acres and all these TV shows, but it never really made an impact until later. I understood what he did. And I just knew this was a special time in the music, and it could never be repeated. That was going to be there forever.
Your father and other members of the Wrecking Crew worked with so many other artists that were really successful. Were they appreciated by these artists?
Oh yeah, very much so, because you realize these musicians, like these session musicians, these people they were working with were not stars most of the time. Brian Wilson was not a star. You know, most of these young acts were not stars. So they depended on these musicians. The only ones that the musicians would have really been honored to play with would have been Frank Sinatra. You know, you're playing with Frank Sinatra. He was the god, you know, at the time. But I think everybody appreciated it because they knew they could go in and out and they could, you know, quickly interpret what they wanted, and that was their specialty.
Awesome. Did your father and other members of the band really love making hit after hit after hit, or was there a little frustration in having another artist take the spotlight for?
That's a good question. No, you know what? It's funny because my dad, again, back to it was a work ethic. Mm-hmm. You figure out in 1960, you know, my dad's 30 at the time. Well, he's coming out of World War II as a little kid, you know, working, and he was a poor Italian kid out of New York, you know, Niagara Falls, New York. He was never supposed to play guitar as a living. So he kind of like fell into it by accident and started making a living, and a good living. So he always said I was a minority. To play guitar and make a living, you're a minority. And he was very, you know, appreciative of that. He said, as much as we made maybe hundreds of hits, I made thousands of bombs. And he said, I never gave the guy back his money. And it's true, because you went to work, you know, and he said, I play for smiles. If you're smiling, that means I'm playing it well. You know, even if I don't think it's the right thing, you know, if he's not smiling, I got to change up and do something else. It might be a piece of crap, but I'm going to keep going until that guy smiles. And once he smiles, then I know I'm doing the right thing. Now, again, in the end, you know, if it's a hit, it's a hit. You just do your best. It doesn't matter how much you put into it. You put 110% into everything you do. Even if it is, you know, you arrange the song. That's part of your job.
Cool. Did you have any favorite recordings that your father worked on, and what were his?
My favorite recordings where a smile comes over the face is, you know, when I can hear him playing, let's say, Memories, which is an Elvis song. Mm-hmm. It starts off with him playing acoustic guitar, and then Elvis starts singing Memories. It's from the Comeback special. Or Up, Up, and Away, or any of the Fifth Dimension stuff where I could hear his guitar come in and out. But, you know, there was a 4-year-old last year at a hotel lobby, and he and his dad or his mom were like doing Batman, you know, and they were going do 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 do, and the little one was going Batman, and it made me smile because my dad played the lead, you know, so it was like he played it first before this little 4-year-old, you know, 40 years later is singing it. It stood out, you know, forever. He would have been appreciative if he wanted to be remembered for something. It would have been maybe scores from John Williams or James Horner or Goldsmith or Mancini. He's, you know, for when John Williams used to write acoustic guitar, he knew who he was writing for. Mm-hmm. He knew who was going to play it in the end. And so to be in that position, knowing that Mancini or Horner is writing a piece and it's coming to you, mm-hmm. you know, in 2 weeks, that's when you've made it. You know, so as much as, yeah, the rock and roll stuff, you know, maybe last longer, there's something special about when you're in that caliber of players and your community among yourselves. You know what you're about.
Yeah.
So.
What do you expect audiences to take from this movie, and what would you like them to take from it?
You know, I played someone asked me the other day, are you tired of talking about the film or seeing the film? The only one I'm tired of talking off camera is when my mom calls me. How's it going? You know, because it's not released yet, so I get a little, it's like, it's fine, Mom, everything's okay. But I watch, the fun thing is the audiences are always different, but they're all getting something out of it differently. Mm-hmm. Musicians are totally a different breed in itself. Musicians think it's their story, but it's also everybody else's story as well. It's like, 2 lines that come to mind when I asked Plaz Johnson, I said, how did this, you know, these guys, let me tell you background. These guys worked 12 hours a day sometimes in the 60s, 12, 14, 15 hours a day. Mm. They would start a session at 8 in the morning, let's say with the Beach Boys or someone. 11 o'clock, my dad go to another session. maybe 3 o'clock another session, and they would do 3 or 4 sessions a day, sometimes into midnight. Right. And they would never turn a job down. You would never turn a job down because then someone else got in. You know, you're freelancers. As filmmakers, we're all freelancers. Mm-hmm. You never turn anything down, never. And my dad got, you know, so it was that kind of like, this train was just going and going. And I asked Plaz, the saxophone player, I said, what was it like? How did it affect your personal lives? Because I know how it affected me. You know, I'm a different side, but he said, well, you know what? And he paused, he says, I'm a better grandfather than I am a father. Now, you don't have to be a musician, you know, and you're too young because you don't have kids yet, I'm assuming.
You assume correctly.
Okay. But all of a sudden, I'm like in that position going, wait a minute, I'm here in Philly. Mm-hmm. I just ran away from Los Angeles for 4 days to go do this thing, you know, called the film festival. Mm-hmm. And it's affected my family, but it's something we have to do. And it happens with a guy that's a plumber that's working 12 hours. You know, he doesn't see his kids, maybe he can't be there for basketball practice. And that's what these musicians did. We all do that. Mm-hmm. And it's the balancing act. The other question, or the other statement that always comes out is, Bones Howe was a major producer, engineer at the time. And he said something, I said, what's it like when you're at the top of your field? I mean, these guys were kings around the world. I mean, the Beatles knew who these people were. And Bones said, well, you know what? You got your ramp up for 5 years and you're at the top of your game. You're, you know, about 10 years. And you got your ramp down. He says, it's not staying at the top that's important. It's taking that ramp down as long as possible. And again, that could be any one of us. I don't know where I am in my career. Hopefully you're not even close to your peak. No. You know what I mean? But you know what I mean? It's kind of like, and that's why we keep going. We just don't know where our careers are leading us. There's, you know, the other thing is people take away is they didn't realize that these musicians played on all these hits. They just assumed it was just the bands. You know, there was no great big conspiracy. It was just the way it was made. In those days, the reason was, you know, rock and roll was really at its infancy in the early 60s.
Right.
Figure we're only 5, 6 years into rock and roll, whatever they call it.
Right.
It's coming out of race music and all R&B. And record companies didn't really trust. They didn't even want to deal with it. But they knew they wanted, you know, if they're going to make money, they got to gamble and put the best at it. So instead of getting the kids in the band to do it, let's get the studio musicians in, let's knock it out in 3 hours. You know, put the guys, you know, vocals on and move on. That's what they would do. Because they had to make sure that, you know, they didn't want to take losses. So, like the Beach Boys, when Brian Wilson, you know, the first few albums, it was the Beach Boys. Then Brian Wilson was writing some major stuff, and he wasn't even going on the road. Mm. So he was setting out in LA working with these musicians. There's no way the Beach Boys could have done this work. For 2 reasons. They're not the musicians that the ones that were on the, you know, Pet Sounds album. Hal Blaine and my father and Glenn Campbell was one of them. Mm-hmm. They were not of that caliber. But the other reason the Beach Boys probably wouldn't have done it is they didn't get along. They were cousins and brothers, you know, to be, you know, they would never have spent hours and days, you know, with each other that long. But there was bands that were made up. It was a product. Rock and roll was a product. It was, a guy would like write a song, a surf song, you know, no vocals. So he'd bring the guys in, my father, Hal Blaine, Leon Russell was on piano, and they would do this group called the Routers. They get a hit, come back, do another song, get another hit. All right, let's put an album together. Puts an album together. This is all within like a few weeks. Puts an album together. Now they got to cast a band. So they cast a band to go on the road, and that's what they would do. Next one, another group called the Marquettes. Same producer, same musicians, same situation. And this kept going. You know, so there were a lot of fake Milli Vanilli groups out there, and that's what they did. But that was the music business. You know, not, you know, Roger McGuinn of the Byrds when they had the opportunity to do their album with Columbia Records, they hired Terry Melcher was the producer. And Terry Melcher was, you know, he had a lot of hits. And he said, listen, if you guys want me to produce, I have to have my musicians to do the first one, because I need a hit. I can't, we won't go anywhere if we don't have the best chance. You know, label's not gonna let us keep going. And they were all pissed off, but Roger McGuinn got to play on it. It was Mr. Tambourine Man. So what he ended up doing was knocked out A side and the B side of the, you know, the single or the record, and it became a #1 hit. 3 hours.
Wow.
You know, Mr. Tambourine Man. And Roger McGuinn said, so when we did Turn, 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 which is another #1 hit with the Byrds, it took 77 takes. It's just the difference in musicianship. They're not bad musicians, it's just not their cup of tea. You know, not everybody in those days, you didn't have overdubbing, you didn't have punching in, you had to play together. You had to have 6 people in a room knocking it out like that. And if one of those people were weak, you affected everybody, because there was no, let's do it again, let's do it again. There was no, you know, you didn't have time, because you only had 3 hours and you had to knock out 3 or 4 songs. That was what you had to do.
Wow.
So, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It sounds pretty intense.
It was very intense. I mean, it's really intense because only a certain group of people could do this. And they were a family. They were, you know, basically they worked together every day for many years. In different groups of people. There was like a couple, there was Hal Blaine on drums, there was another, Earl Palmer was a drummer from New Orleans. And, you know, 4 or 5 guitar players.
That's really impressive.
And they went in and out.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, because you don't, I don't know how many backing bands you have like that now in the music industry.
Not many. It's not necessary. I mean, you still have your specialists. You'll still have your, like, oh God, he's the guy that's solo on such and such, and you know, you pull in that, you know, great guitar player or stuff.
Right.
But it wasn't, you know, in those days, you didn't have the budgets to keep going. You know, when they started doing albums, literally albums, they turned into called recording projects. Right. You know, where they would take months in the 70s and 80s. I mean, the waste of money is really what killed, I think, my opinion, what killed this business. A lot of things killed the business, but that's, I think, the waste. There was at one point, United Artists was a record company at the time. They were doing an album a day for 6, 7 weeks. 6 sides in the morning, 6 sides in the evening. That's how it was. It was like, knock it out. So the product was extraordinary, the amount of product coming out.
Wow.
So
it's pretty cool. Shifting gears back towards the film, since the film has been released, how's the reception been generally? Oh,
it's been awesome. I mean, it's the greatest feeling. You know, it's so cool to watch people just totally jump into it. I mean, there's nothing better than, you know, audience awards and stuff like that. That's always a pleasure, but, you know, it's fun because it's a happy movie. It's not a documentary like, oh God, they got screwed. It's not like that. You know, it's a joyful, and it brings back a lot of memories for a lot of people, the music. And it's more than just the music. I mean, when you see it, you'll understand. But it's been fun. I was invited to Israel last month. Someone said, what's it going to take to get it here? I said, well, a nice plane ticket and a donation towards the licensing. So the guy sent, you know, got me a ticket and I went, you know, 4 days, back and forth. And it was great to see it in a different culture. Because as America's greatest export is the music and film. So to see, you know, people in the audience go, wow, they know that music. You know, same thing, I did it in Barcelona. And I did it in England. I just came back from Vancouver. Well, Vancouver's not that far off, but, you know what I mean? So watching different audiences get into it is really the pleasure now for me.
Cool. How did your father feel about having been made that much of an impact worldwide?
It's a good question. You know what? He didn't realize it until he was in the 80s. He was doing seminars around the country and actually around the world. He was with Fender Guitar. And he would do monthly seminars. And he had this thing where he would play the kids, you know, certain things that he had done, and he didn't realize. They would go, oh my God, we learned off of that. You know, he didn't realize how much the impact they had until later when people were telling him, So I mean, he was quite, thrilled. I think as you get older, you appreciate the fact that you're appreciated. So.
Very cool. Documentary filmmaking can be a really, spontaneous, kind of crazy, long process. Was there any part of it that really stood out to you, or that you really enjoyed in the whole making of it?
Yeah. Anytime I have to ask questions to anybody, it doesn't even matter this job. I love talking to people. So when I was interviewing like Brian Wilson or Jimmy Webb or Mickey Dolenz of the Monkees, a lot of these questions I'm asking them, they've never been asked. Like Glenn Campbell. No one ever spoke to Glenn about his session days. When I talked to him about 8-10 years ago, it's always Glenn Campbell, the star. No one knows he was one of the greatest session players of all time. He was a wonderful guitar player. And they're always thrilled that I'm talking about something that brought back really fond memories and asking them questions that no one has ever asked. And I get off on that, doing that.
Great.
Yeah.
That's actually all I have for you right now, but I really want to thank you so much for taking the time out to come and talk to us today.
I appreciate it.
Of course. Denny Tedesco's film, The Wrecking Crew, is playing this weekend at the XPN Film and Music Festival at the Annenberg Center on Saturday at 5 p.m. and on Sunday at 12:50 p.m. That's all for now. I'm Chris Blondell, and you're watching the Pretentious Film Majors.